Hi, my name is Peter Andras. I'm a professor at Edinburgh Napier University. This is my lecture series on the evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 14, Cells and Multicellular Organisms. This is part 1 of lecture 14. In this lecture, we will look at how systems exist with unit systems and how systems come into existence through the interactions of unit systems, as we discussed in the advanced concepts lecture. So first, we will look at cell systems with many unit systems, and we discuss how the unit systems of the cell system work. We will consider how across many unit systems we find an infinite cell system, and we discuss about environment adaptations of the unit systems of cell systems. So if you consider the cells, as we discussed earlier, the cell is seen as a system of molecular interactions, where many of these molecular interactions involve proteins. So the interactions between these molecules is the system that forms the cell. And all those molecular interactions that follow the referencing and continuation rules of the cell are part of the cell. Now, there are structural constraints on the molecular interactions, such as membranes, fibers, and so on, which constrain how these molecular interactions happen, and by constraining them, increase the reliability of the sequences of molecular interactions. And having these structures makes the cell have better predictive sustainability. Now, coherent sets of structures define what we call institutions in a general sense. In particular, in the context of the cells, these are the functional subunits of the cell, such as endoplasmic reticulum or Golgi vesicles and other parts of the cell. So these are sets of coherent constraints which define functional components of the cell, which also constrain the molecular interactions, improving the ability of the cell to maintain itself. Now, if you look at the reproduction of the cell, reproduction in the sense of reproducing the molecular interactions that constitute the cell, what you see is that these molecular interactions happen by engaging other molecules from the environment of the cell, by interacting with some of these molecules or by encapsulating into the cell parts of the environment, either through pinocytosis or phagocytosis, when bits of the environment gets incorporated into the cell, gets enveloped by an internal membrane, and molecules are extracted from this vesicle, which are used within the cell to produce further molecular interactions that facilitate the reproduction of the cell. The cell also releases molecules into the environment. These are the cell secretions, could be antibiotics, toxins, or other molecules, which are secreted in order to facilitate the production of an environment which produces the right kind of molecules that the cell molecules can interact with or can uptake from the environment, such that they support the further reproduction of the cell. In addition to this, the cells also move through their environment. For example, bacteria can swim, moving their flagellum, and by moving through the environment, they again interact with the environment, and they also seek parts of the environment where there are molecules available for them to support their reproduction. Now, the cells expand as well as they reproduce their molecular interactions. They also grow. They grow by growing the number of proteins that they use that participate in these molecular interactions, and grow the molecular interactions within the cell, ultimately leading to the replication of the cell by division. Now, the cell division happens when the cell reaches sufficient size, reaches sufficient growth. And at that time, the molecular interactions within the cell change, while previously they focused mainly on production of proteins and structures within the cell, functional structures within the cell that support the growth of the cell. When sufficient growth is achieved, the DNA replication becomes the dominant among the molecular interactions. In eukaryotes, which have a cellular cell nucleus, the nuclear membrane gets dissolved, the DNA gets compacted into chromosomes, and then when all this happens, the cell segregates the DNA into two parts, and that is followed by the separation of the two halves of the cell. Now, how this separation happens, that depends on the cell type, but ultimately there is some mechanism which separates two halves of the cell into two cells and realizes the cell division, and then the cells grow separately as two new cells. Now, what we describe here is how the cells evolve, and what we said, these cells as a system are the system of all molecular interactions which follow the rules of the cell. So what we see is that we have multiple cells which have the same DNA, so effectively they produce the same kind of RNAs, the same kind of proteins, and the same kind of molecular interactions. And all these cells with the same DNA realize the cell system. A cell system in the sense of producing this right kind of molecular interactions. Now here, just to note, that same DNA have to be understood with some flexibility. There are some variations in the DNA, however, mostly the DNA is identical across cells of the same kind. So what we see is that the cell system is such that involves all these molecular interactions across all cell instances that produce the molecular interactions corresponding to the DNA of the particular kind of cell. So let's say for a particular kind of bacterium, all instances of the bacterial cell produce the same kind of molecular interactions overall. And they follow the same referencing and continuation rules. So the cell system is really encompassing all these individual instances of individual cells which realize an instance of the cell system. So all cells together constitute the cell system itself. So what we can see is that each individual cell is a constrained instance of the cell system, where the constraint is delivered by the cell membrane. The cell membrane encloses the molecular interactions that constitute the particular instance of the cell system. Now there might be a cell wall or cellular matrix surrounding the cell membrane as well, which further add to the constraining of the molecular interactions that happen inside of the cell. So what in our view, then the cell membrane is this kind of coherent set of structural constraints which defines the unit system of the cell. So the unit system is a realization of the cell system which is enclosed within this structural constraint, which is the cell membrane itself. So the unit system as a single cell realizes the molecular interactions according to the cell system, and the cell as a system, as an abstract system, is the collection of all these unit systems which deliver a realization of the cell system in the context of the structural constraint defined by the cell membrane. So what we see here is that the unit system is the individual cell, and the cell system itself is the collection of all cells of the same kind. So this is somewhat different from how we perceived or how we discussed cells earlier, which was focused on single instances of cells. And now we see that actually the cell system itself includes all instances of the cell. And all instances of the same kind of cell form the cell system. And the individual cells are the unit systems of this abstract communication system, which is the cell, which is a system of all molecular interactions that follow the same set of referencing and continuation rules. So the unit system is a single cell, and this single cell is constrained by the cell membrane. So effectively, the single cell has finite existence times. Depending on the cell type, this can be minutes or days or possibly years. There are some cells which persist for many years, for example, multicellular animals. But generally, the existence time of any of these single cells, any of the unit systems, is finite. There's also a finite number of kinds and instances of molecules. So that, for example, in a bacterium, you may find a few thousand kinds of molecules, perhaps millions to billions of larger molecules over the lifetime of the cell, and also a finite or a very large number of molecular interactions. So what is important to see here is that the individual cell, the single cell, the unit system of the cell system, has a finite existence both in space and time and in terms of the molecules and molecular interactions that are involved in the existence of the cell, of the unit system. So the overall abstract cell system includes all these finite existence cell instances, all the unit systems together, and these are included together over space and over time. So all cells that follow the same referencing and continuation rules, or in other ways, which have the same DNA, which drives the production of RNAs and proteins in the cell and ultimately molecular interactions in the cells. So all these cell instances together form the cell system. And the cell system, as an abstract system, expands over space through the many units of many unit systems of the cell system that exist in different parts of the space. And it exists over time, so many unit systems that exist at different times. So for example, if you consider a bacterium, the bacterium grows and divides and then further grows and divides each of the bacterial cells. So each of these bacterial cells are a unit system of the abstract system of the bacterial cell. And all of them that exist at the same time across some space, they are all representing the same system. They all belong, all those molecular interactions belong to the same cell system. And in the same way, as bacteria develop, some of them die, some of them divide, they exist over time as well. And as long as the bacterial population exists, is instances of the same bacterium existing over time, that bacterial system expands over time and persists over time. So it's important to see that the individual cells are these unit systems, unit system instances of the abstract cell system. And the abstract cell system exists over a wide range of space and over a wide range of time as well through the instances of the cell system, the instances of the unit systems. So the cell system persists over time through these unit systems and expands over space through the unit systems which exist at the same time. So where this leads to is that ultimately the cell system, at least in principle and potentially, it is an infinite system in time and space. Each of its unit system instance is a finite system instance, both in time and space, but because there are many of these unit system instances existing across space and across time, the cell system itself, which is the abstract system encompassing all these unit systems, it is potentially infinite because it can exist potentially across infinite space and across infinite time as well. Now, what we say is that the unit systems are finite in time and space. However, at the same time, each of these unit systems has the full memory of the full cell system, so the DNA that they have. So this DNA encodes all possible RNAs, and these encode all possible proteins in the cell. So each unit system has the full memory of the cell system, which allows it to produce all of the possible interactions, molecular interactions within the cell system, which compose the cell system itself. So in the same way, if you have a single cell, which is an instance of cell system, that can be the root of the growth into largalization of the cell system, because it can divide if it finds an appropriate environmental niche where it finds the right molecules to grow and multiply. The cell system unit will produce many instances of the cell system across space and time, and it expands the cell system. Now, of course, there are some exceptions, for example, red blood cells, which don't have DNA, but we will consider these in a moment, and we will explain how they fit into this general picture. Now, the cell system units, the individual cells, adapt to different environments. So if you consider, for example, bacterium, depending on what kind of nutrients are available in the environment, the bacterial cell will produce different kinds of molecular interactions, which are specific for the nutrient environment and facilitate the take-up of the available nutrients in the environment. So there is some environmental adaptation of the unit systems by producing these appropriate molecular interactions. And effectively, this leads to an environmental adaptation or environmental specialization of the unit systems of a cell system. Now, this leads further to like subtypes of the cell system, where the different subtypes have different kinds of behaviors because they adapt to their environmental niche and they produce certain kinds of molecular interactions which fit that environmental niche. So, for example, if you look at a multicellular system, take for example the slime mold, which is a kind of temporary multicellular system, it has the stalk and the spore cells which generate different kind of behaviors, a different set of molecular interactions within them as they exist. And in general, to achieve this, the cells use different parts of their DNA, activate different parts of the DNA to generate different sets of RNA molecules, and these are used to generate environment-specific proteins. Now, it should also noted that there are generic proteins and generic parts of the DNA, kind of housekeeping parts of the DNA, which are always active. And of course, there are also the parts which are involved in the division of the cells, which are active at those particular times. However, there are these particular specific parts of the DNA which are environmental, which reflect environmental adaptations of the cells. So, the adaptation to the environment of the unit systems leads to the adaptation of these and to differentiation of the cells. So this leads to the cells with different behaviors, different shapes, adapt to the environment, while they all produce the molecular interactions which fit into the cell system. So they have the kind of housekeeping, general purpose molecular interactions, and then they have also their specific environment adapted molecular interactions. Now, there are also cases when cells reach what we call terminal differentiation, which is an adaptation to the environment to an extent where no further unit systems are generated. So this is when the cells, the unit systems of the cell system, adapt to their environment to an extent where they are no longer supporting the expansion of the cell system in time and space, but rather they support the maintenance of the cell system at a given time and a given space. So for example, if you consider the stalk cells in the slime mold, these cells die and they do not generate any further new cells for the slime mold, but during the time when their functionality is needed, they support the generation, or rather the maintenance of the cell system, which is the cell system of the slime mold cells. Now, here we note that this kind of terminal differentiation, because it no longer requires from the cell to generate new instances of the cell, may lead to the loss of the memory of the DNA of the cell system. So this is what we see, for example, in the red blood cells in vertebrates, reference cells in plants, which in both cases, the cells do not retain their DNA, and they deliver their functionality, supporting the maintenance of the cell system where they belong, but will not contribute any further to the replication, multiplication of the cell instances. Now, let's have a look at the cell system size in terms of how big can these cell systems grow. Now, there are some very large cells. So, for example, the ostrich egg cell can grow up to about 170 millimeters. That's about 17 centimeter large. There are some algae which can grow into so-called syncytial cells, which are kind of joined up cells, either with one or multiple nuclei. And these algae can have up to 200 millimeter cell size with a single nucleus. There are a number of other cases where cells join together into a single cell, if you like, with multiple nuclei. And in Myxogastria, these single cells can grow perhaps even up to 1 meter size. However, if you compare this with the size of the cell systems, including all instances of the cell system in space where the cell system has many cell instances, what you can see is that those cell systems with many unit cells generally achieve much larger overall size than the syncytial cells or the very large cells. So, if you look at the evolution of cells with unit system, of course we don't know exactly how this emerged, because today all cell systems, all biological systems that we have, they have all cells. The syncytial cells appear perhaps rather as reverse adaptations, kind of adaptations moving back to an earlier state, because in all these cases what you see is that cells join together and then get reorganized in some way to form these large syncytial cells. So it is quite likely that having developed the cell membrane and the cell membrane structure that separates the system into a number of unit systems, that gave an evolutionary advantage to the biological systems which had this adaptation of having unit systems and cells, and they had much better predictive sustainability than other potential living systems which did not have the cell instances. So today we see only biological systems which have cell instances. All right, so to summarize, we discussed here the cell system is somewhat from a novel perspective by considering them as systems with unit systems, as we introduced the concepts of unit systems among the advanced concepts of this systems theory. And we saw that the cell system can be seen as the collection of all cells delivering the same molecular interactions, having the same DNA that drives the production of RNAs and proteins in these cells. And all these cells together define the cell system. And each of these cells is seen as the unit system of the cell system, where the unit system is defined by the coherent structure constraint, defining the cell membrane possibly together with cell wall and cell matrix. And abstract cell system is the sum of all these unit systems over space and time. So all unit systems, all cells existing over space at a time form parts of the abstract cell system, and as they exist over as time as well, they all are part of the same cell system. So while each of the unit systems have finite existence, both in space and time and in terms of molecular interactions, overall the cell system, which includes all abstract all unit systems of the abstract system, it is potentially an infinite system. And finally, we discussed about the unit systems and the unit system adaptations, how they adapt to the environment, how they become specialized and differentiated. And we also noted that some may become terminally differentiated, where they do not contribute any longer to the production of new instances of the cell system, but rather contribute to the maintenance of the environment of the other of the cell system. So those cells which produce new instances of the cell system can do this in the most advantageous conditions. Finally, let's see a few questions and answers. Can cells with finite lifetime consider an infinite abstract communication system? And what we said is that indeed this is what we think, that this is the case, that each individual cell has a finite lifetime, has a finite existence. But if you consider all them together across space and time, potentially they constitute an infinite abstract communication system, which is the cell system as an abstract system. Next question. Do unit systems of a cell system have the full memory of a cell system? And the answer to this is yes. The unit systems, at least most of them, have the DNA, which is the full memory of the cell system, describing all possible allowed RNAs and defining all possible proteins which facilitate the molecular interactions in accordance with the cell system's referencing and continuation rules. So the unit systems of the cell system have the full memory of the cell system. Next question, can unit systems of a cell system have different shapes and behaviors? And again, the answer is yes. We have seen examples. We mentioned, for example, the slime mold with the spores and the stalk and the various specializations of cells in multicellular organisms. So in general, the unit systems can have different shapes and behaviors, while they all maintain the kind of general housekeeping side of the cell system. Through their adaptation to their environment, they may develop particular kinds of behaviors, they may adopt particular kinds of shapes, however, they all belong to the same cell system. Finally, can terminally differentiated unit system generate new instances of the unit system? And the answer is no, they cannot. That's what we said, that these terminally differentiated unit systems no longer contribute to the replication of the unit systems of the cell instances. They contribute only to the maintenance of the cell system by contributing to the maintenance of the environment, which facilitates the maintenance of the other cell system units, including the ones which produce new cell system units through replication. Thank you.